Center for European Policy Studies, or CEPS, is a European think tank in Brussels. It's actually one of the largest and most influential EU think tanks. And we are not specialized thematically, but we try to specialize in all things where an EU could or should have a role. So we have units ranging from traditional topics like agricultural policy or foreign policy to things like education and employment. And my unit, Jobs and Skills, we are focusing on education and employment policies. Originally, EU didn't have any role in education and employment. That's been changing over time, with employment emerging especially as one of quite important policy concerns over the last 20 years, and especially since late 90s when the European Employment Strategy was established. Having said that, EU still uses mostly sort of soft instruments to persuade national governments to change their policies. So there is policy benchmarking, measure, how countries are doing. There is a little bit of use, increasing now, of the European Social Fund to motivate countries to undertake labour market reforms, etc. On the education front, there's even less. The EU is still quite a weak actor in terms of influencing national policies in the European Union. A lot of our attention in terms of research is focused on national employment and education policies and challenges. We're currently the very high unemployment rate for young people, and the difficulties they're having in entering, even higher education graduates are having big problems in entering labour market in many member states. So that's one of we are trying to understand that in depth and to maybe go beyond cliches, which is also one of the things we're doing in this project. We participated because we thought this issue of youth unemployment at the European level, so to have a large-scale comparative analysis of issues facing European youth in terms of employment and skills, it deserves an in-depth analysis. And we are looking at migration, but we're also looking at students as workers and workers and students. Because one of the things that has happened over the last 20 to 30 years in particular is that the overlap between workers and students has grown so much larger, especially with so-called massification of tertiary education, as so many young people study, and many of them also have to work or want to work while they're studying. So we're looking at to what extent is this a European-wide phenomenon, what is the differences between countries, and what types of jobs are students doing. Because, for example, student jobs are very often associated with this sort of McDonaldization approach that you flip burgers or clean houses. What we actually found using data is that nearly all over Europe, students are actually doing medium-skilled jobs. So they are doing jobs which are not low-skilled, and which make use of their upper secondary education they already obtained or the skills they are already getting at the university. So we actually found that there is generally a great deal of complementarity between what people have already learned and what types of jobs they do. So this sort of McDonald's image of students flipping burgers is not generally true in Europe. Of course, these are gross simplification, but still we find that very useful. There are great differences between countries in terms of how much students actually work. And to some extent that's related to how young people behave, but we also found that countries differ a lot on how many older students they have. And we found that since it's the older students that account for the bulk of working students, what really determines how much your students work is how many older students you have. That seems to be the #1 influence we found. The other piece of research we're doing, major piece of research we're doing is on migration. Generally, the word migration in Europe is associated with migration from outside Europe. And we've used data to look at to what extent that is true and what are the migration reservoirs within Europe. And we found many things, but the two sort of interesting things are that the intra-European migration, if you look at Europe really as a whole, not just at the EU member states at the time, is a major factor. So there was a major migration from South, even before South was a member of the EU, in 60s and 70s. And there was a major movement from East in the 90s, before the East was a member of the EU. So what we found was that if you look at Europe as a continent rather than as a political entity, there was a lot of inter-European migration since 1960s from South and East to, let's say, core Europe or Northwestern Europe. And what we've also found, however, is that the emphasis has changed, going from south to east. So while the south dominated a lot of the intra-European migration between 50s and 80s, especially since 90s, there has been a shift of emphasis to Eastern Europe. But what we found also is that countries very much differ on that. North is North and Scandinavia, Germany is the Eastern European migration has overtaken the southern one by far. Whereas if you look at Spain or France, then that's a very different picture where the southern migration is still larger overall, cumulatively speaking, than the eastern migration. There is a large element of high-skilled migration to especially the new eastern migration. So the migration between, let's say, 50s and 70s from south was relatively low-skilled, but even that is now changing. So the migrants that are now leaving the south are much more high-skilled than they used to be, and the eastern migrants have always been more high-skilled. I think the brain drain issue is much more complicated because you also have a lot of returns, and so I think the key question is, are people using those skills well in the target countries, and are they coming back home? And there, the research we have done finds that the Eastern European migrants in particular are more likely to be overqualified for the jobs they're doing, let's say in the UK or in Germany, than the Southern European migrants. So it's not just the brain drain, but it's their skills are not sufficiently used, and it takes longer for them to work their way up the labor market.